The bat that's up there on the screen at the moment is a serotine bat. It's an English bat. And in its way, it's a specialist. It often comes as a shock to people to actually discover that there are 16 bats in the UK, 16 different species, that is. This is just one of them. All those bats are all very different. And the reason is that to make use of the available biomass, the available insects, these are all insect eaters, they've had to specialize. And in that specialism, each of them has ended up looking really quite different. This thing is quite a large bat by UK standards, wingspan or something like that. And it specializes in feeding on large flying moths and beetles, lives in houses, and it flies in sort of parkland situation. But in other species in that 16, some of them are specialized in picking insects off the surface of water. Others still are what we call gleaners. That's bats that pick insects off foliage or off the ground. So to do that, you'd have to have a bat that can hover. The one that was over water tends to have quite long, narrowish wings. And there are still others that are way up above the trees that have long, narrow wings and can fly very, very fast. So they're all actually really very different indeed. But there are limiting factors on the numbers of bats that you can actually get in the UK, simply because the food resource is very seasonal. We have a winter and there's no insects around in the winter. Also, the trees can't grow in the winter, so there's no fruit or anything like that available in the winter. If we move along, just to see if this works, and go somewhere else in the world, this is Central American tropics, these constraints are removed, and we have no real winter to talk about. There might be a bit of a dry season, but there's no real winter. And trees can grow all year. There's fruit available most of the year. So there are many, many more opportunities for bats to take advantage of in a place like this. And in consequence, of course, there are lots and lots more species. 16 in the UK. This is in Belize. There's at least 70 species in Belize. Now, what I want to do, I'll have a look a little bit more just quickly at some of this habitat that's available to the bats. That's tropical forest. It's from pictures taken from a hilltop in the Chickabull Forest, where the museum has actually got a forest reserve. And that little point there is actually the research centre. You can stand on the top of that hill there and look in 4 directions and just see forest to the horizon in all directions, and that's the only man-made artefact you can see. So it's a big area. And the forest itself is very, very diverse. Lots of big emergent trees, lots of areas of dense forest, more open areas, areas with high canopy and nothing underneath. You can go on for a long while in that sort of vein. There are also, it's on a limestone soil, so there are lots of cave systems, places for bats to roost and hide. All these lovely places to make lots and lots of different niches for the bats. I mentioned fruiting trees. Well, there are actually sort of a dozen species of tree in the UK. You go here, in this area, there's at least 270 species of trees, and most of them are fruiting trees. So, what do we have? Bats that eat fruit. There are lots of them. Not true fruit bats. True fruit bats are only found in the Old World, but we have bats which eat fruit in the Americas. And here we've got some. Now, what I want to do is look at the heads of lots of different bats and see how we can actually interpret the way they look into what they actually do for their lifestyles, how they feed and forage, and in cases roost. Now, you'll notice that all these bats here don't really have too much of a muzzle, and the fellow down the bottom here does, but we'll come to that in a minute. They've all got really relatively round jaws. Well, that's actually an adaptation to eating fruit. You need not to have really large canine teeth, so there's no need to have a big pair of canines there. You need something which is going to strain and crush and pulp up relatively soft fruit. Not always too soft. Sometimes they're quite hard. So they're quite powerful as well. But these round jaws are quite typical of American fruit-eating bats. There's a lot of size difference there as well. Of course, there's a lot of size availability in fruit too, and you can get really quite big things and very tiny things right out at the ends of branches. The fellow on the right there, called great spear-nosed bat, is is a very large, strong, heavy animal. And you're talking of a wingspan something like this, and really quite a handful. A very, very powerful set of jaws, so it can carry, when it flies, big fruit, and it'll go to a favourite roost, and you'll get a big pile of debris underneath. And very important in spreading seeds and things like that in the forest. The smaller two at the top, they can get at fruits which are right on the end of little thin branches, which the bigger bat couldn't get at. So they're all choosing slightly different sets of fruits in slightly different situations that they can actually get at. The one down the bottom, as I intimated before, is a little bit different and has a slightly more varied diet. If you look at the longer muzzle on that particular animal, and you can also actually see quite nicely there, see the little patches of yellow on it, and there's a bit on its jaw. Well, it's obviously been at nectar and pollen as well. So it's got a slightly more varied diet than the animals up at the top. All of them will, in adversary, take other items of food. So if there's, for some reason or other, a crash in the fruit population, or the fruit that's available, they can survive on the odd insect and things like that for a little while. But they're basically fruit and nectar feeders. There's one other thing we should mention before we leave those, and that's, of course, bats find their way around in the dark. And for the most part, they do so using ultrasound. Now, ultrasound is a very, very high-pitched squeak, basically. It's way beyond our hearing. Most people know that, but they don't realize actually just how complicated it is in bats. All these funny ornaments on the faces of these animals, we call them spears. These are all these bats belong to one family, spear-nosed bats. And they're all to do with producing that pulse of sound so that they can then listen to the echo. They actually squeak out through their nostrils. Now, you can imagine if I was to shout out through my mouth, sound goes out in a huge, wide wave. But if you want to see where you're going with sound, that's really not a lot of use to you. You want something more like a torch, so you can actually shine it and see where you're going. Now, those appendages on the nose do exactly that. They focus the squeak that comes out into a nice shape. And depending on what the bat is looking for and how it's using its ultrasound, it can actually make a wide beam or a narrow beam. It can use different frequencies, which will allow it to get a really fine picture from close up to something, or it can shout very loud at low frequency and maybe detect a beetle 50 meters away in open free space. Very difficult for one bat to do all those one things in one set of equipment. So, again, we have specialization. And some bats go for the long-distance, loud, low-frequency call, and others go for a rather high-definition, high-frequency call close up. And that is all affected by those nose leaves and the size and shape of their ears to a degree as well. So squeak comes out through the nose, echo comes back and is picked up by the ears. These are fruit bats. They're looking for static things in trees and finding their way around. So basically, the system is relatively simple in those animals that you're looking at there. And that's a close-up of the little Corollia bat, the one that was down on the left. You're looking at its nose leaf there. And you can see the fine detail in that nose leaf. You also see all the blisters on its lower lip. Well, that's, again, a very common feature between fruit-eating bats in the Americas. It's to do with careful manipulation of the pulp of the fruit and the juice. Just picking up a bat that you don't know what it is, if you see those features, you can be beginning to think, yeah, this is an animal which is in fruit and nectar. Same family of bats, but different specializations. Still got relatively large eyes. Fruit bats do tend to have large eyes. The one on the left has got quite a big eye, the one on the right is getting smaller. And these are bats with a much, much more general diet, a large amount of insects in it, insects which are caught on the wing. We call it aerial hawking. So they're echolocating these little tiny flying insects on catching them on the wing. The one on the left probably takes a certain amount of nectar and stuff as well. So more specialisms. These are bats which will feed not particularly within foliage, but around it and along forest tracks and things like that. Again, same family of bats. All these animals have the same common ancestor, but these are gleaners. These are bats which are using high frequency, close range, flying close to foliage and the ground and picking things up off the ground. They're also almost certainly passive hunters. If you look at those huge great ears, that's the clue to that. Now, what I mean by passive hunting is that they'll hang up somewhere, dead quiet, and just listen. And they hear the little noises that are made by beetles in the leaves and moths thrumming their wings and things like that. And they'll home in on that and then perhaps just use echolocation at the last moment just before they come to catch them. We can tell a bit more from looking at these. The one on the right, if you look at its lower jaw, it's a relatively weak lower jaw. So it's probably taking soft-bodied insects like moths, maybe caterpillars and things like that off the leaves. The big fella here, if you look at its lower jaw, it's massive. And it has some really quite large canines hidden in there which you can't quite see. And in fact, that eats a lot of what we call katydids and crickets, and it even has been recorded eating small birds as well, probably things like hummingbirds and things like that. So a big, powerful animal, one rather less so, but both of them with very, very specialized features on their faces. If we could run, I've got some video for you here. Before you actually start it, I would point out to you, these are bats in the hand. And bats are a bit different from other animals. They don't suffer shock or stress in the same sort of way as a lot of other things. So please don't get worried about the fact that these are animals in their hand and they might be upset. They're not actually being upset at all. They might get a bit pissed off with me holding them, but cross. But they're not really going to be too worried. I mean, often you can actually feed them a mealworm in your hand and they'll happily sit there and munch it immediately. It's come out of a mist net. So if we could just run that video. And this is the great spearnose bat that you were looking at. A few seconds of video is a million times more meaningful than an odd still picture. You see I've got it in a glove there, but it's a big, strong animal. I'm a little bit worried that it was going to get cross with me and give me a nip. Small fruit bat again. See the bubbles on the lips and the big spear nose? Very close relative of it, again. And these are animals that would hover around flowers and fruit, right at the ends of branches where the big bat couldn't get. Often quite pretty. Lots of stripes on their faces and things like that. Again, another one. Interesting, this one, and it's what we call sexually dimorphic. The males have these big spots on the shoulders. I should say there, if you climb about in branches, you don't want a tail membrane, so it just has free legs without a big tail membrane. This is the female of the same thing, very, very different looking. It doesn't have the yellowy-orange spot on its shoulders, so a trap for the unwary there when trying to identify them. And this, again, from that one slide that you looked at before, this is the Corollia species, and that takes fruit and a certain amount of pollen and nectar, and will occasionally take odd insects. Now we've got one that I haven't illustrated before. If you watch in a minute, it'll flick out its tongue. It has a very long tongue with actually a little feather duster on the end, and it lives on nectar and pollen almost exclusively. Will take the occasional insect it finds in flowers. But its tongue, compared to its head, is enormously long. Really quite a fun little animal. This, moving on, is into into an insect-feeding animal. And it's very much an aerial hawker, and that a close relative of it, which is probably a little bit more into insects than the previous one was. You get an idea of the size, and a little bit the size of the wings there as well. They're a bit longer than they are in the fruit-eating bats because of its aerial hawking sort of capabilities. Another very close relative of the previous two, with slightly larger ears, this animal. What does that suggest to you, anyone? well, don't worry, we won't have time before the video ends. But that suggests that maybe it's a passive feeder as well. And here we are into the gleaning bats, the fellow with the huge long nose leaf, and gives you an idea of that size. And that lovely head-on view, how it uses its ears almost like rifle microphones. It can incline them forwards and really focus in on where a sound's coming from, really pinpoint it before it whips in and tries to catch the insect. Okay, if we hold it there, anyone got any questions, first of all? Yeah, far away.
Yes, some time ago there was a scientist handling a bat, and he caught rabies from it, and the subsequently died. Is there any chance of that happening to the general public or anyone other than someone handling the bat to get rabies or something like that from a bat?
I thought somebody would ask that question. It's been inevitable when it's been in the news recently. And rabies was unknown in this country until very, very recently, when actually a bat worker actually died from it, a bat worker in Scotland. So we now have to accept that there is rabies in the UK population of bats, but it's at a very, very low level, and to the general public, the risk of you catching it is so far remote as that you can leave it discounted. To me, as a bat handler, there's a very real risk, and I have to take precautions. You saw me wearing gloves, and I have all the vaccinations and everything else.
But they do go on to cattle and things like that, which they say that is spreading rabies in the country. Would they actually take to a human being?
Yeah, and let me address your first point. There's only 3 bats in the world which are vampires, which live on bat blood. They're all live in Central America. Only one of them, one of those 3 species, will actually attack humans, and it does so very, very rarely indeed. For the most part, they live on cattle or animals actually in the forest. Very few of those actually carry rabies. Some do, and it is a problem, but it's a problem which is completely localized to Central America. Bats in this country that have rabies are far more likely to give it to one another. They don't bite people. They all live on insects. Then you're not going to get bitten unless you see one on the street and go and pick it up. And then it might give you a nip. In which case, the first thing you should do is go to your doctor and get a jab. The chances of it actually giving you anything are really remote. But you should still, if you did get bitten. But you can see what I mean. It is a remote possibility.
Is the bat population of England declining? I seem to think that when I was a child, I used to see lots of bats in the garden flying about. I don't seem to see it now.
You're right, the population seems to have declined horribly, certainly from just before the war, particularly when insecticides started appearing, and we were probably doing a whole lot of things which impacted really badly on bats at the time, like eliminating them where they were using buildings that we were using simply because we didn't like the sight of them, running down the available biomass of insects, which was their food, and changing the habitat with intensive farming, cutting down woodlands and cutting down trees, hollow trees and things like that. And all those things had a real bad impact, and populations were plummeting away. Hopefully we're just beginning to turn the corner, and things may be just beginning to show signs of getting a little bit better. But that's being optimistic.
A couple of weeks ago I was walking along the Way Navigation Canal, and there was a bat colony there which was man-made, and opens up automatically to let the bats out. Is this something that is normally done?
Well, I actually designed that building, and it doesn't do quite what you said. It is actually, it was built as mitigation for a tunnel which was knocked down in the building of a new piece of road, and we needed to put somewhere else for the bats in to roost, and that was what that was for, yeah.
There's another question over here.
Do they not have a natural predator, apart from human beings, of course? In their, I mean,
yeah, they do.
Are they on anyone's food chain, sort of thing?
If I run on, if we can go back into the ordinary slides, Let's skip him for a minute. And this fella here is a South American bat, again from the same area. It actually belongs to the same family as the fruit bats that you were looking at. But that's what we call a woolly false vampire, and it's a carnivore, an out-and-out carnivore. It eats other bats, it eats birds, it eats small mammals. It's big. And it's very, very strong, very interesting animal. Actually, if we do the same sort of facial analysis on it, if you like, it's got a very large set of ears. So it fairly certainly hangs around listening. Noises of other bats, it can hear them perfectly well. It can home in on them easily. It's also got a very effective ultrasound system. And if you look at its lower jaw, again, it is a massive, powerful jaw, capable of crunching up the skulls of smaller bats with no problem at all. So, yeah, in the tropics there's those. In this country, by way of predators, there's owls, to a certain extent. There are no bats which live on other bats in this country, or indeed in Europe. Generally speaking, if a bat lives through its first year and gets over various problems with finding roosts, finding food, and settles into a repeatable annual cycle, it'll live for a very long time, 20, 30 years, without too many problems. There's no... Cats take a few, the rats will find them in hibernation occasionally, but there's no real single thing that predates them, no. Occasionally you get an owl which becomes a bat specialist and will eat very little else, but they're exceptional.
Frank, sorry, I'm over here now.
Yeah.
Do we know what the nearest mammal is that the bats are related to?
Really interesting evolution, actually. They sort of appeared out of nowhere in the Eocene, and there are bats from the Eocene which look almost identical to what we have today. We have no original bat that the others evolved from. It's speculated that they came from small insectivores which were running about in the trees and started developing the habit of hanging about a bit like our passive hunting bats and then jumping out and trying to grab things that were passing close by, and in consequence started to develop membranes that gave them a little bit more support and more range, and as soon as they developed that, they were on such a winner that they just expanded very, very rapidly.
Do we know why other mammals don't seem to have developed this echolocation, or have they?
Well, yeah, there's quite a lot of other mammals which actually use ultrasound, but they don't use it seemingly for actually finding their way around. They use it for communication. Shrews use it a lot. Quite a lot of the small rodents use quite a lot. But it seems to be only the bats which actually use it for echolocation. There's a bird that does, which uses clicks a little bit, but it's very primitive compared to the bats.
I think we had one more question. Did you have a question, sir?
Which country are the vampire bats native to, and have they ever been found going wild, living wild in this country?
No,
have they ever got out and gone wild in this country?
No, they're entirely limited to Central and South America.
They've never escaped in this country? Central America?
Central America only, yes. They're very small. People think that vampire bats are enormous, but in actual fact they're really tiny.
Does anyone ever use them as food?
Bats are eaten around the world, yes. We'd have to move countries a long way to find where they're regularly eaten, but if you go to the Pacific Islands and the Indian Ocean Islands, indeed in India, I believe as well, they eat the true fruit bats, which are much bigger than the bats we've been talking about up until now, and they can go up to a couple of kilograms in weight. In fact, in a lot of places it is quite a major problem that we're actually going to see species going extinct because they're all being eaten by the local populations. Yeah, it is a bit of a problem there. But yes, they are eaten, yeah.
There's not a lot of meat on them anyway, is there?
No, but if you're half starving, I don't suppose that would worry you too much.
I think we probably better press on now because we're running out of time.
Yeah, okay. I'll just quickly show you some vampires here. This is a vampire which is one of these 3 Central American ones. It's not the one which actually attacks cattle, horses, or us. It's a thing called a hairy-legged vampire, and it feeds on the blood of birds. Still has some nice vampire traits, though. You see those little teeth there? It needs those to make a little nick in its prey. And if we quickly look at its face, it has such specialisms in there that they're actually a little bit difficult to read when you first see it. Huge eyes, because it must approach its prey very, very quietly indeed. Lots of birds can actually hear along a lot higher than we can. So it has to find its prey in the dark, using eyes and as minimal amount of ultrasound. And it also seems to actually, just quickly go back to that, it seems to get knocked about quite a lot when it's doing it. If you see the nose leaf on that one has got a lot of scar tissue on it. If we go back again, you can see there's a cut on the cheek of that individual and part of its ear is missing. And I think the birds peck them occasionally, and that's how they get these marks. But where I took these, there's lots of ocellated turkeys. They're really quite common in the forest there, and I think they're probably the chief prey item. The bat will land on the birds will go to roost, usually in the same sort of tree each night, same sort of area. The bats will get to know where it is. They'll land on the branch some meters away and run along the branch, come up underneath where the bird's roosting and give it a little nick on the ankles and then lap up the blood as it flows. So poor old turkey's got a bit of a battering. Have we got enough time to show a little bit more video? Yeah? Okay, well, let's have another piece of video, show you some of those animals. This is a thing called an old man bat. It's again a fruit eating. You can see it's got a very round jaw. It's a bit of a bizarre animal altogether, actually. Maybe talk about it a bit more. We're running out of time a little bit. This is the woolly false vampire, the predator that I showed you just a moment ago. Very interesting developments. Sorry, it's popped out of focus there. Very interesting developments on the nose leaf. And that's to stop when it's feeding blood and gore getting in and messing up its ultrasound apparatus there. So it could actually close those. And here we're into our vampires, and this is again hairy-legged vampire, very alert, very bright, very brainy animal. Now you can see his wonderful hairy legs. Again, you don't want to have a tail membrane which is going to get in the way when you're scurrying around on branches and things. Okay, just quickly we'll show you some more images. Just hold that if you would, if we just go back into the stills for a tick. Right, and this is just very quickly looking at a few more different faces. We've moved into different families of bats now, but just to show you the diversity of things. These are all from the same area. They're all living in the same pieces of woodland. And this is a tiny little bat which lives on mosquitoes and gnats and things like that. It echolocates not through its nose, out through its mouth. So when it flies, it has to have its mouth open all the time. And they live in little family groups, and they specialise in gnats over water. And it has fur which disguises it as lichens on a tree. So you get a little family group, and they'll all get onto a tree, and they can hide by all looking like a patch of lichen all in together. Again, an insect eater. It's a bit more orange here than it is in real life, I'm afraid. I wish it was that bright. But its eyeball's right in its ear, completely in there. And it has a very peculiar legs and huge tail membrane. So you can also see there that it actually has quite long canine teeth. Lots of insectivores need those long canine teeth if they catch beetles or something like that to stop them escaping. And finally there's a rather handsome, jolly-looking fella. It's called a black mastiff bat. It's one of the commonest bats in Belize, actually. The locals actually get very annoyed with them because they all live underneath their tin roofs in really quite large colonies and can become quite smelly. But this is a bat which flies huge distances, and it has long, narrow wings, can fly very, very fast, and it actually lives almost certainly well outside the forests that I was showing you, but flies in every night. and then forages up above the forest canopy and uses those great big teeth there to catch larger flying beetles and things like that. So there you are. You've got a picture of all those different animals there, all banged into one big area of forest. Thank you.
Just before we finish, I think we've got time for a few questions. One thing I was wondering, you were talking a little about Belize. What's it like to actually work out there photographing the bats in the jungle?
Well, for anybody who's interested in natural history, of course, it's sort of a dream come true, really, Adam. And you can't move. The place is just heaving with life in all directions. And the locals actually tell me that it's gone downhill since they were there in the first place. So what it was like then, I really don't know. But you can... when I was trapping continuously for 3 weeks there, and still at the end of that period, I was catching new stuff. And I still didn't have a full picture of what was there. But... it's hot, very hot indeed, and you're being eaten by insects the whole time. It takes really quite a lot of concentration to keep on the ball, keep what you're doing under control, and collect data in the way that you should be, and really keep everything ticking along the way it should be. It is difficult.
What are the difficulties in filming and taking still photographs of bats in particular?
The main one is keeping your equipment working. An awful lot of modern equipment, of course, is electronic, and electronics and humidity don't go very well together, especially at dawn when you've got big temperature changes. Everything is misting up. You can't see what you're doing. You've got to dry everything first of all. Those sorts of problems. But once you've got stuff up and running, of course, the number of bats that are present is orders of magnitude greater than it is in this country. So that aspect of it then becomes an awful lot easier. And there are plenty of subjects to get on with. But keeping the gear working is the problem.
How did you get interested in bats in the first place, in particular?
Largely because they're a very, very difficult, untouched subject. I mean, most of these things that we've been looking at here today, very little is known about them. And I would love to have the time to go out there and stick radio tags on them and track them around and see what they're doing all the time and find out more about their lifestyles rather than speculating about what their lifestyles are from their actual form. Get some backup data, that sort of thing. Very fun.
So did you start as a photographer and then develop an interest in natural history, or was your background in
No,
natural history?
I've been a naturalist since I was about this big, I'm afraid. That's why I've been here so long, I think.
Does anyone else have any questions? Yes. Over here, Mark, if you can go.
Are the nets that you use for catching the bats very different to the nets that you use for catching birds?
No, they're very similar indeed. And in fact, a lot of the time we use exactly the same nets. If you know about nets, the bird nets tend to have very large pockets in the net. A net is broken up into 4 or 5 panels, and the net between two lines which divide the panels hangs with a little pocket. So if a bat goes into it, it falls down into the pocket and is then enfolded, same as would happen with a bird. Bats tend to get cross with being caught like this and start neatly snipping their way out of the net very quickly indeed. So we tend to make the nets with rather less pocket in there so they don't become quite so entangled quite so easily. But that's about the only difference.
Would you wear a glove to extract them?
Oh yes,
So
very
does that
certainly.
get quite difficult then?
It is very difficult indeed. I wear a glove on the left hand and keep my right hand free, so I can control the bat with a hand that might be bitten and then carefully remove the net from it with the other hand. We do use other sorts of traps as well, though. There's a thing called a harp trap, which is quite fun. Big square metal frame with lots of parallel fishing lines going vertically between the top and the bottom. And there are 2 banks of these lines. The bat flies up towards it and goes, oh, there's a bank of lines. Gets a bit closer, and then it echolocates on the other bank of lines. Gets a bit confused because they're separated, and touches the line. And it's only got to wingtip it just a little bit, and it's enough to make it lose its balance and fall. And when it falls down in the bottom, there's a shiny plastic bag that it can't get a grip on. and it can stay down in there long enough for us to come along and pick it up.
I think we've probably got time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, the pictures you've shown us, the bats have claws on the end of their wings. Do they use those claws?
Oh, yes, they do. Depends a little bit on what the bat's particular specialism is. In some of them it's developed very powerfully indeed. In others, there's even actually a South American one that has a little sucker pad just by the base of its thumb. That claw that you see there is actually its thumb. And the rest of the fingers then become the support for the wing. So it's got its claw here and then the big bit of the wing with hugely elongated fingers down there. And that claw there, they'll walk on those thumbs or they'll hook on with them. But of course most of the time they hang by their feet upside down.
Well, I think, sadly, that's all we've got time for today. Can I remind you that we do these Darwin Centre live events twice a day, 11:30 and 2:30, and many of our talks are archived on the website, so you can see some of the ones we've done in the past by logging on to the Natural History Museum website and then going over to the Darwin Centre. I hope you've got a glimpse of some of the amazing complexity of these creatures and also some of the role that the museum's work here and out in Belize goes towards conservation and filling in the gaps in our taxonomic record. But for now, a big thank you, please, to Frank Greenaway.
Thanks very much.